Hi there. So, my guiding question for the issue paper was about how do we learn and how can we learn to learn better? This presentation approaches learning as a skill, and as a skill, it means it's also something that we can practice and improve. To start off, a few words about why thinking about how we learn is important. With the explosion of online educational resources, MOOCs, etc., skilled learners can get so much free knowledge from online resources, but it's important that we understand how to learn in order to get the most from these online resources. So my interest in this subject started this summer when I took an excellent MOOC on Coursera called Learning How to Learn, taught by this woman here, Barbara Oakley, a professor at UC San Diego. She talked about what are effective study habits and what are ways that students shortchange themselves in their studying. So one way that less effective learning habits show themselves is through illusions of competence. Now, illusions of competence are when a learner believes that they've mastered a subject, but either they don't fully understand it as well as they think they do, or to understand it, they're relying on resources and notes. They actually can't remember it on their own. So, of course, this is something that we want to avoid. If we put our time into learning something that we need to know later or we want to know later, it's frustrating when we come back to it and realize we didn't understand it as well as we thought, or that we can't remember it at all. So this is where I want to talk about what learning strategies actually lead to the most significant recall of information. I also want to point out here, this is just a graph to show my point, that even though it's going to seem like it, I don't necessarily think that learning or education is about recalling facts. Obviously, there's a lot of other important social, cognitive, development things that are going on in education. But it is also necessary to build up a foundation of knowledge, and so that's a small chunk of this big picture of education that I'm focusing on here. So, I'll be talking about different strategies and their effectiveness, and this information comes from a meta-study where 5 educational psychologists reviewed 10 years of data for a study where they looked at 10 basic learning techniques and reviewed all of the data and research on them to show which one of them had actually been proven to be the most effective. So they categorized the techniques based on how useful they were proven to be. The ones that were found to be least effective were summarization, highlighting, using keywords to remember information, using mental imagery to remember information, and rereading a text multiple times. The techniques that were found to be moderately effective were elaborative interrogation, which means coming up with a rationale or explanations for why something that you learned is true or correct, as well as self-explanation, which is the study strategy of explaining your steps to yourself while you're problem solving. The two learning or study strategies that were found to be the most effective were active recall and distributed practice. So I'm going to go into each of these and talk about what they are a little bit more. Active recall. So when a learner studies with their notes, their class materials, their textbooks, etc., it can be easy for that line to become blurry between what they've actually committed to memory and what they've mastered and what simply makes sense when they read it. It's easy for a learner to think that because they understand it, that they have mastered it and that they've memorized it. So active recall, what that is basically the practice of making yourself remember information without those memory cues, notes, etc. This is what we do on tests often, but it's also something that we can practice on our own. So I won't go into a ton of the research about why active recall is the most effective, but I want to show this because I think it's really interesting. A researcher named Tulving took MRIs of people's brains when they were encoding, that is learning new things, so in this case they were learning new vocabulary words, versus when they were engaged in retrieval. So this is when they were quizzed on the vocabulary words and had to remember them. And basically what he found is that different areas of our brain lights up when we're doing these different activities. So we're using our brain in different ways. And so what that means is that if we're always encoding, if we're always putting information in, but we never practice taking that information out and using it, except for once a semester on a final or a test, then that retrieval system of the brain is significantly weaker. Although active recall is effective and has those reasons why it's effective, as mentioned in the last slide, obviously it's not something that we think of as a common study strategy. So here's something interesting. It is a survey of undergraduates at Washington where they were asked to list what study strategies they used, and the percentage who listed a strategy is in the lighter blue column. And then they ranked the strategies by what they thought was the most effective. So the darker blue column is the percentage of students who list that as the #1 most effective. So rereading your notes and textbooks was used by the largest amount of students and thought to be the most effective. We have practice problems, rewriting your notes, and then self-testing, practicing recall. Those strategies were in the bottom, and only 1% of students believe them to be the most effective. So even though this is the most effective study strategy, it's found by students, or it's believed by students to be the least effective. So there's a lot more we could go into about recall, but I want to talk about the other highly effective strategy, distributed practice. And so this is basically the idea that while learning, you are spacing out your practice into multiple review sessions rather than doing it all at once. So the obvious contrast here is cramming. Cramming is actually a pretty effective strategy for the short term, as long as your learning and the assessment of your learning are really close to each other chronologically. However, if you learn something today and you need to remember it later for a final, for a different class a year later, for a job interview a year later, a different project, something, distributed practice is significantly more effective for being able to remember something that you learned a long time ago. So this is something that kind of shows that. This is a graph from a paper by Barak, who is a distributed learning scholar. It shows the results of one of the many experiments where distributed practice was shown to be more effective than cramming. The x-axis shows the learning sessions that the participants of the experiment were asked to go through, and then the y-axis shows how much percent they got correct in their first review. So the different lines here are different groups of people who were asked to study a little bit differently. The top line with the diamonds is people who were doing their test sessions all right after one another. The line with the boxes is people who were doing the review and test sessions a day apart from each other. And then the bottom line is people who were doing the review test sessions 14 days from each other. So what they found is when they got to the very final test session, which for this experiment was the 4th one, that the people who had been practicing only every 14 days were steadily getting better, but they weren't doing quite as well as the people who had done it a little bit closer together one day or all at once. However, the experimenters then brought the participants back a month later for a 5th test session, and it was found that the top line here, the people who had been doing it en masse, so all at once they'd been doing their study sessions, they were not able to recall that information a month later. However, the people who had been spacing it out a little bit, either by a day or by 14 days, were able to recall the information. So the effectiveness of distributed practice sort of depends. How long do you need to remember something? If it's something that you want to know for a long time, or something that you're learning now that you're going to need to call upon in a couple of months or something, distributed practice is going to be way more effective than cramming or mass practice. So, just to recap, quiz yourself, what were the 2 most effective learning strategies that we talked about? The first one was active recall, and the second one was distributed practice. And that's all I got. Thank you for listening.